and welcome back to another exciting edition of Culture Kids Storytime. Last time we read the first chapter of the book Heart and Soul. Today I want to dive into the second chapter. America has a very dark history, one that impacts our ancestors in ways that are undescribable. Slavery was one of the most horrific points in African history and our existence within the Americas. This next excerpt talks about one particular slave and his account of some of the things that he dealt with. He actually tells a story about when he was a boy and when he was captured. These stories are important for us to reflect on how strong that we are as a people. All of the trauma that we have gone through, all of the hardship, pain, heartache that we have endured, and still we rise. These stories are not meant to make us sad, but to show us our resilience. So let's check out chapter 2, Slavery. Them days was hard. Delia Garlick, former slave in Alabama. This may sound funny to you, but my grandfather Joseph, he didn't allow any of his kin to eat black-eyed peas on New Year's Day, even though it's an old African-American tradition. The beans bring good luck for the coming year, they say. But Pap, which is what we called him, wouldn't hear of it. When he was a young boy, each New Year's Day, buckets of black-eyed peas were boiled and poured into a horse trough for all the slaves on the plantation to eat like animals. Pap hated it and vowed that none of us in his family would ever allow people to treat us that way. Pap was the only Africa-born slave in my family. Pap was captured in 1850 when he was 6 years old and brought to America. Even though it had been illegal to capture and import slaves to America since 1807, it still happened, and often. On New Year's Day of every year, Pap told us the story. When I was a child, I would play with all the other children in my village while the grown folk, they were working far away in the fields. They told us to look out for kidnappers because there were stories of people who went missing. Mostly children left at home during the day. One day when the folk were gone out to the fields, several of those people ran into the village carrying nets and clubs and grabbed me and several other children before we could cry out. They covered our mouths, tied our hands, and ran off with us into the woods. The children were marched for miles all the way to the coast, where a large ship sat out on the water. For days, Pap and many other captured Africans were kept inside a large fort on the beach before they were brought back outside and paddled in a small boat to the ship. Below the deck, African men, women, and children were packed like fish, chained together and crammed into spaces so tight that they could not stand up. It was dark, and their air was heavy with the smell of sickness and the cries of women and children. When the ship was full, it set off for America. The trip lasted several weeks. Pap was sold to a planter in Maryland as a playmate for his son. When he reached the age of 7, Pap was sent out to work in the field as a field hand. I could tell you about the life of a slave all day long, but even then you couldn't guess the awfulness of it. Slaves are people who are property of other people and must do whatever they are told. They were bought and sold as one would buy and sell any animal or thing. Slaves had no right to property, to family, to come and go as they pleased, to read or write, or to speak their language or have a last name. No right even to protect themselves. No more rights than that of a horse or a pig. The only right a slave had was to work for his master, and work he did. Every morning, the slave driver blew the work horn or rang the bell, and all the slaves woke up, grabbed a hoe, and headed out to the fields. In the summertime, the sun was up early and down late, and the air was hot, heavy, and full of mosquitoes. With each strike of the hoe to the ground, the slaves sang to keep time with each other and help ease the hard work. Spirituals were born right there in the fields. Singing was the only way to keep from dying inside. Pap said it was the saddest thing in the world to hear slaves sing those songs, but it sounded so beautiful. Made him want to cry. Some of those songs held secrets too, codes, to pass on messages to other slaves right under the nose of the overseer. Like when a slave started singing "Steal Away," folks knew it was time to run away. Or when they sang "Follow the Drinking Gourd," the slaves knew to escape in the direction of the North Star, right at the foot of the Little Dipper. To ease the trouble of their hard lives, the slaves got together and danced on Saturday evenings. Most other evenings, they slipped off into the woods for prayer meetings, praying for the day that freedom would come. Since Pap didn't have any blood family on the plantation, older slaves took him in as their own. Before he went out to the fields, he lived in the big house with a woman he called Aunt Hattie, who worked all day under the watchful eye of the missus, cooking, cleaning, sewing, even nursing the missus' children when they needed milk. She raised all 3 of the missus's children. There are about 100 or so slaves on the plantation, and they were always hungry and dressed in rags. Most of them went barefoot because the master didn't give them but 1 pair of shoes a year, and the shoes weren't made to last. In the fields, they were watched by the overseer, who rode around on a horse making sure everybody was doing their work. And honey, that fellow was mean. To keep the slaves in line, he lashed them with a curling bullwhip he kept on his shoulder, tied them to a tree, and whooped them right in front of all the other field hands. Folks a mile away could hear them awful whippings. It's no wonder so many of the slaves wanted to run away. You might wonder, why didn't they fight back? Child, believe me when I tell you that they did. Every step of the way. But unlike their fellow Africans who captured them, they didn't have any guns to fight back with, so they fought with their fists and died. They fought over the ocean on slave ships and were shot and drowned. They fought in the fields, in homes, and in factories where they worked and were whipped, beaten, and murdered. They fought and lost almost every time. It would be a long while before we figured out that we could not win our freedom with our fists or guns. We would have to find another way. This is so telling of even what we see today. You know, we are still experiencing brutality in many of our communities, and it's a story that has been passed on from generation to generation. The atrocities or terrible things that happened during slavery have impacted a lot of people's views even to today. As we are raised and we grow up, we learn different societal norms or ways to treat each other, behaviors. And some people aren't always taught behaviors that allow them to be kind to other people who don't look like them. And that's ultimately one of the biggest problems with slavery, is a mentality that Black people were inferior, or we weren't as good as the slave masters, who were typically white men or white women. And that is just not true. We as Black people are just as smart, just as creative, just as brilliant. And that is why we had to do so much to overcome all of these things that happened to us so that we can start to see the progress that we're seeing today. Just keep in mind that the work is not done. There's still a lot of work to happen in order for us to truly realize all of the things that we desire in life. So know that you are part of this big puzzle, but it's important for you to understand the beginnings. The other thing to keep in mind is our history didn't start with slavery. Before slavery, we were kings and queens and sorcerers and wise women and healers and people in Africa who were incredibly brilliant. We had many gifts, and we taught colonizers all of the things that we knew, because that's who we are. We are a giving, sharing people. And so, you know, as you go through your day and you look at things around you, give thanks to your ancestors, because chances are they had a hand in creating that thing or that technology that you have grown to love. Always remember, slavery was a part of our history. It interrupted our history. It is not the beginning of our history. Our history goes further back. And so to learn about this piece of our history is only a piece of the larger puzzle. So I encourage you to continue to read, learn, explore, and understand your origins of this very complex world. I hope you'll tune in for next week's edition of Culture Kids Storytime. Have a great one.